Hi everyone. So today we're going to do the lecture on who's who. So it's kind of a short lecture, although knowing me, I'll probably just talk a lot. I don't know. We'll see what happens. Just before we start though, hopefully you all saw the video announcement. So I saw the number of views. There was like quite a few. I'm trying to remember offhand. I want to say I remember thinking, oh, like at least half the class. So hopefully the rest of you have seen it since I checked like 2 days ago. It was just on how to access the ebook on Canvas, and then it was some stuff about some information about the upcoming assignments. But okay. So who's who? So just like before, I'm sorry, I've had like the worst dry mouth all day. Okay. So there's obviously a PowerPoint uploaded on Canvas, who's who, so hopefully you're watching this and looking at that PowerPoint together. Ideally, it's up to you. Okay, so who's who? So actually the name of the PowerPoint is Who's Who, Darwin and Pre-Darwinian Ideas. So that gives you a little more information about what we're going to talk about. Okay, so slide 2, Charles Darwin. When I first made this PowerPoint, when I started teaching this class years ago, I always put Darwin at the end because the whole point of this PowerPoint is like pre-Darwinian thoughts in the science world, and then Darwin, and then but I realized that I think because a lot of people have heard of Darwin, that it made more sense to talk about him first and then talk about what kind of came before him. So that's what we're doing. So Charles Darwin. So if you remember from that first PowerPoint about the introductions, and I had a handful of pictures up, and I asked if you recognized anyone. I had this picture of Charles Darwin. I pointed. You don't know what I'm pointing at. Obviously you guys know my laptop's right there. Anyway, Charles Darwin. Most of the time when people see the picture of him, it's like when he's older. He's got like the long white beard. But this is one of him when he's very young. So a little background on him. His grandfather was a famous naturalist. So the term naturalist, now we would say like biologist for the most part. So the term they used back then was naturalist. So he had other members of his family who were researching and curious about the biological world, animals, plants. So he wasn't the first in his family, but so he kind of grew up having that influence a little bit. I think a lot of you have kind of heard the story, like he had studied theology at some point. And well, I don't know, maybe you haven't. Like I remember even before I really got into this class, like when I first took it years ago, I remember hearing, just because of our, the cultural information, I just remember hearing some stuff about Charles Darwin. I didn't really know much, but that was one of the things that I knew, that he studied theology. So maybe you knew that. I don't know. Okay. But anyway, so in his early years, he had some, scientific influences, biological influences in his family. He, but was studying medicine and theology at university, and that just really wasn't working out for him. And so in 1831, he had the opportunity they needed someone to travel on this boat. They were going to be traveling around the world, different areas. They needed someone who had, some basic knowledge of plants and animals to collect some data, some information, record what had been seen and observed. And so they needed someone with a little bit of a background. And he was like, sounds like a great opportunity. And he thought it'd be a great time to, travel and see things. But also, obviously, he had a curiosity for the world and for, animals and plants and the way biology worked. So he went. And then of course the last bullet point, you'll see this is, so one of the famous places that he went to was the Galapagos Islands. Slide 3. So while he was there and traveling in general, and a lot when he got back and started really going over all the data he had, this whole time he's processing all this information that he's getting, and he's realizing that he has an idea about something, and he's thinking that this might be an explanation to what he's seeing in nature. So I think I don't know if I mentioned this in the last PowerPoint with you guys, but a lot of times before this, a lot of scientists didn't do their own data collection. Many did for sure, but a lot of them kind of relied on the stories and or information of other people who had traveled. And so a lot of this is like second or third hand. And so, but Charles Darwin had, actually gone out and had observed a lot of this, and had observed a lot. One of the famous stories about the finches, that he came back with these examples of these birds, and he was asking a local, I hope I'm getting this right, ornithologist about it. He thought they were different species because, well, they looked kind of similar, like similar size and stuff. They clearly had like extremely differently shaped like beaks. And so he was asking his, friend and colleague about this, like, okay, can you help me identify, do you know any information about these different species? And they must be clearly like different, very different birds. And the ornithologist was like, no, these are all finches. And then this is just one of many things that Darwin started realizing, there's something interesting going on here. So actually, there's a really good movie. I always forget the name of it. It's about Charles Darwin, and Paul Bettany plays Charles Darwin. And Jennifer Connelly plays his wife. Oh, I want to say it's called Creation. That's probably wrong. But if you Googled it, I think I saw it on Netflix, but that was years ago. But that could be a movie you watch for extra credit. Per the extra credit instructions in the syllabus. But it goes into his early life and him writing this, but all the background, and all of the ways he kind of contemplated these ideas, and a lot of his family life and his personal journey. This is a very, very good movie. So if you're interested, it's very good. But what was I going to say? Oh yeah, so which we'll get into in a minute. He, it's not as if no one in the scientific world or in the world in general had considered there were probably biological processes. There's probably something going on, but not to this degree. And a lot of them hadn't. Well, they weren't correct. But it's not as if no one had those ideas and no one realized that changes were occurring through time. But the way that Darwin really visualized it and was able to show with evidence and this book on the origin of species, which I would recommend. It's a big book, and it's the writing's a little heavier, in terms of maybe for an intro student. But by all means, if you feel like you want to read it, it's actually quite interesting. But he had made multiple observations during his travel and when he got back about how the morphology of animals can change and does change, and why it changes, and what's going on in the environment. And he started realizing there was a process going on, and this idea that he had is called natural selection. Now we're going to spend a day, I think a whole PowerPoint, talking about evolution. I want to be clear on this. Evolution, there are five forces of evolution, 5 different ways that evolution can occur. Natural selection is only one of those. It's not every time you hear about evolution is natural selection. There are 4 other ways that change. Remember, a change in allele frequency in a population over time. There are 5 ways that can happen. Natural selection is only one of those. Unfortunately, sometimes they're conflated as being equal, but that's not accurate. Now, often when we're talking about evolution, the evolutionary process, we're talking about natural selection, but that's not the only. There's 4 other ways that it can happen. And often you might hear the term Darwinian evolution, and that is in reference very specifically to natural selection, because Darwin, his idea was natural selection. Okay, so anyway, so he started, coming up with these ideas. He wrote this book, and he decided to present his ideas formally to the scientific community. Moving on to slide 4. Yes, and he had been communicating with Alfred Russel Wallace about this, and they realized over the course of their communication that they had very similar ideas, and they realized that better for them to present this together, power in numbers, and because they thought there'd be some ridicule because it was very different from what other people had thought was the process that had been happening. Because, at this time, people are starting to discover, dinosaur bones, and they're realizing, whoa, okay, maybe there were animals that existed that don't exist now. Maybe the world is actually really old. It's not just a few thousand years old, the way we've thought. We're finding fossils of animals that are not here anymore, and they look kind of similar to animals that are here still. So maybe there's, people understood that, scientists, I should say. Oh, and in fact, actually, it's interesting, in that movie, because it's like in the 1800s, his daughter comes home from school, Darwin's daughter, and she's like got in trouble at school because she was talking about dinosaur bones, and her teacher was like, I don't remember exactly what happened. I saw this movie like 10 years ago, but the teacher was like, that's from the devil or something, I don't know. And then so she got in trouble, and she's like, but they found the bones, you know. So this was like, you know, there's a lot of upheaval socially and culturally because people are starting to realize there's a lot more going on in the world, and in biology and in nature than anyone had really understood. So Darwin and Wallace present their ideas, and let me see if I have it on the next slide. I do not. Oh wait. So they presented their ideas, and for the most, it's hard to say, like, whether, I wouldn't say it was well received, but people, it probably goes either way. It depends on who you're talking about. Some people were like, yes, this sounds amazing. This actually explains things that we didn't understand before. This is really interesting. And some people will be like, no, doesn't explain anything. You're wrong. And as we get into some of the lectures, like in the following, like next week, it'll be clear why. Like, they just had a lot of biases based on what they thought was happening biologically, and Darwin's like, no, that's actually not happening. And because that's not happening, this is actually what's happening, and this is the process, natural selection. So people just had a lot of biases at the time. But anyway, of course, like, his ideas have stood the test of time, and now, like, he's got like millions of studies backing up what his idea was. And now we know this is clearly the way it works in nature. So you might be thinking, okay, I've heard a little bit about Darwin, now I know a little more. I've heard of natural selection. I think I kind of might know what it is. Not quite sure fully, so we're going to talk about that right now. So slide 5, natural selection. So what is this idea? And I hear people use this term, and I'm like, you're not really using it correctly. Sometimes people do, but, you know. So there are a few things kind of built in this idea, and some of the things that he had noticed while he was traveling and just, you know, being an observer of the world and nature, that there are some things. And like I said before, the movie goes into this a little bit, how he kind of teaches his kids, like, notice things, and the world isn't always what you think. Like, you have to pay attention and observe, and look at everything. So per the PowerPoint, one of the things he notices is that resources are finite. So there are a limited number of resources, whether you're talking about the whole world or whether you're talking about like an area, that resources are going to be, that it's not like there's just resources forever. You know, there's a limited amount of, you know, water or plant food or animal food. Like it's going to vary from location to location, but it's never infinite. It's finite. And then of course I put like even mates too. Another point is variation exists. This is super important, variation. This is going to come up a few times in this class, this idea of variation. It's in my opinion, it's often one of those factors that's kind of forgotten about, like, oh yeah, variation. But I think it's so important. The variation exists. So like if we were in class, I would say, look around the room. Like, we're all human, and we're male and female, but there's going to be variation in height. There's going to be variation in hair color and eye color. There's going to be variation in speed, like we were running. The list goes on. You know, things that we can do physically or parts of our body. There's going to be variation in everything. Nose shape, ear shape. You know, we'll talk about some of this later with some of the genetics lessons. And waffle. Okay, I think she's okay. I don't know if you guys could hear that. She's got allergies. Okay. Variation. Variation is really important because for any given like trait, like if we're talking about height, for example, there's going to be variation. For eye color, there's going to be variation. Variation for everything. This is super important. The next point: competition exists for those finite resources. There's a limited number of resources. There's going to be competition to some degree amongst certain parts of that population, depending on what the resource is. There's going to be competition for it in some way, either directly or indirect competition. There's going to be competition for those resources because everyone wants food to live, right? It's going to be competition, whether it's plant food or animals, you know. And the next point: variation of the characteristics. So those physical characteristics means that some of the traits will be more beneficial than others in that particular environment. And this is kind of the idea of natural selection, that in any given environment, there are going to be certain traits that are going to be more beneficial for that environment. Maybe in another environment, they wouldn't be beneficial. And maybe within an environment, there are going to be traits that aren't necessarily beneficial depending on what the variation is. So like, for example, let's say we're talking about like a really cold environment. There might be animals, there's variation, like let's say fur density. Some very little density, some a lot, and some maybe really extreme, you know, in the fur density. Or we could be talking about fur color or something. Given that particular environment, if it's very cold, the more fur probably the better. To stay warm, obviously that's going to be probably make or break whether you survive if it's like very like snowy or something. But in a warm environment, the opposite trait would be beneficial. So it's the trait, but it's also the environment. It's the interplay of those two things that for any given environment, there are going to be certain traits that are going to just work better in that environment and other traits that don't in that particular environment. And like this is true for like whether we're talking about weather or elevation or oh my gosh, I'm blanking. Like whether you're close to the ocean or not, whether the terrain is mountainous or sandy, or whether it's an open prairie or it's a dense forest, like anything environmental like you can think of, whether it rains all the time or like the list goes on. There are certain traits that are going to be beneficial in those environments, or combination of traits that are going to be beneficial in an environment with a combination of factors. And then the last point. So some individuals are just going to be more successful evolutionarily in terms of like whether they survive themselves, but more importantly, do they produce offspring who survive and thrive in that environment? That's the whole point. Because what they're going to end up doing is passing down those genes. So I think I do not have a picture. We have a lecture that I give more details about natural selection. I have a lot of visuals, so it'll be more clear then. But hopefully this makes sense to you, that in any given environment, because there is competition, because there's variation in traits, some of those traits are going to be more beneficial given that environment, and those individuals who have those traits will be more successful in terms of like surviving and reproducing. Like that's it. It's not complex, really. I mean, it can get really complex. Like this is a simplified version. It's not really controversial in any way. It makes a lot of sense. But the reason that a lot of the people had problems with it at first, like some of the other scientists, were that there were certain, like I said, there were certain biases they had. Like a really good example is when you look at, let me back up. Oh, I didn't want to go on a million tangents. Okay. What this idea relies on is the assumption that people understand how reproduction works. And if I were to ask most of, please, I hope you would know. If I asked you, like in a very clinical or like give me the medical terminology, if I asked you how does like human reproduction work? Hopefully you'd be able to tell me like there's a male and a female, there's sexual intercourse, there's a sperm and an egg. Like you would understand like technically like the process. You're like 50% genetic information from the male, the father, 50% from the female. And then you get, after so many months of gestation, there's an embryo and then a fetus and things are developing. Like you understand like at a basic level, like the genetic part, 50-50, you understand like reproduction, like you understand all that. But as you can imagine, there was a time in history where people didn't understand that. Maybe they understood it partially, but not fully, and especially the genetic stuff. Like, so at the time of Darwin, they thought, well, they didn't really understand this process, that it was like 50%, 50% combination. There's like way more to it. Like we'll talk about this a little bit about like recombination and like some of the stuff that happens in that reproduction process. But for them, like in general, this is treated like 50-50. They still didn't really understand this. And like the example I was going to give a second ago. So if you look at the world, if you look at like plants and like coloring is a really good example of this, or height in humans is a good example, but coloring. So they would say, well, look at these plants. There's a red one and a white one, and when you combine them, reproduce them, you get a pink flower. They're just blending. You're just blending away those traits. So if things are just kind of blending away, then how can you say that one trait is more beneficial, and because it's beneficial to be passed down, if it just kind of gets blended away over time? And like I said, height would be a good example of this. Like I'm a really good example of this. I'm 5'10", my mother is 5'4", my father is 6'4", so I'm like perfectly in the middle. Now, That's not always the case. Obviously, height, like, oh man, we're gonna get into like some complex discussions on genetics, and I don't want to do that right now. Oh, I have to sneeze. Maybe not. But that kind of seems like a blending, right? I'm not like just as tall as my dad or just as short as my mom. But obviously, like I was gonna say, you know that if I had siblings, probably we would see that's maybe a really short sister and a really tall brother. Like, you know, I'm just one. But you could see how people might, like, at least at the surface level, superficially be like, that doesn't make sense, Darwin. Traits are just blended away. So your idea about them being beneficial and being passed down doesn't really work if they're just kind of blended away through time. No one's really going to have that full trait in the way that you're describing it to be beneficial in that environment. Hopefully this makes sense to you. And Darwin was like, well, he had an idea about genetics, and it wasn't fully correct, but it wasn't wrong. But we didn't understand the genetics and reproduction the way we understand it now. Now, I'm getting on so many tangents. I feel like I'm giving the lesson that I'm going to give you next week. Oh my gosh. I know I am. I'll just say, before I basically have like 2 lectures in one, you probably have heard of Gregor Mendel, and we'll talk about him next week. But Mendel basically said, or he was doing research at this time that would have like totally backed up Darwin, but no one really knew what Mendel was doing until later, and then it's like, oh, we understand it all. Like, Darwin was right, and Mendel showed that it was correct, and now we have like the whole field of genetics. Okay. Anyway, so I just want to say, like, a lot of the other scientists were like, okay, Darwin, like, that kind of makes sense, part of it, sure. The other part, not really. I mean, he had some people who were like, no, he's right, and some people know he's wrong. It was very controversial in the science world, what was going on. But this was like a groundbreaking idea. And like I said, now we know it's completely correct. And now we have expanded on this field in so many ways. Okay. Slide 6. Okay, so now we'll talk about Darwin and natural selection and the other forces of evolution later. We have a whole PowerPoint on evolution. But the point of this PowerPoint is who's who. So now you know who Darwin is. So we'll talk about some of the people who kind of came before him, so you can kind of see how they influenced Darwin's ideas. So on slide 6, it just shows a list, and we'll go through these individuals. There's like a slide per. What do I have? Like 6 people. Okay. Slide 7. So Linnaeus. He is famous for formal classification and organization, or we call like taxonomy. In fact, I think I'm going to talk about taxonomy later in this class. So basically, like if you were the first human, and you looked around, or even the first, like, I guess, species who had the mental capability, so probably any ape, and you looked at nature, and let's say animals, for example, and you're like, okay, there's so many animals. I need to organize them and classify them in a way that makes sense to me, to understand, evolution, ancestral relationships, to see who's related to who, to kind of organize them into groups. Linnaeus is kind of the father of that. And so, like, you are all probably familiar with this, oh man, kingdom, phylum, class. This is so bad. I feel like I know I'm skipping something. Family, order, genus, species. I feel like there's one I missed. But and also per the bullet point here, binomial nomenclature. So like when you talk about a species like Homo sapiens, that's binomial nomenclature. So you say the genus and the species name. So our genus is Homo, sapiens is a species. So he's kind of responsible, like the father of this, like understanding, classifying, organizing, naming all of these animals. Now a lot of it he got wrong, and a lot of other people around the same time got it wrong because of how they tried to classify. So like a good example of this is like, if you're like, oh, okay, all creatures who fly. Now you might think that's a really good way to kind of separate those who fly, those who don't. That sounds like a good way to separate animals. But then you start thinking about it, you're like, well, that's not really because there are birds. But then there are bats, and bats are not a bird. Like they're not related, closely at all. So that becomes a problem. So like one of the great things, like I said, about science is we're a self-correcting system. So over time you realize that like that's not correct. But he is the father of this idea. Number 8. Or slide 8, sorry, Buffon, another naturalist. So he, like others, understood that there was probably a process of change over time. They just weren't sure like how it was happening or what was happening. And he was one of the first to be a proponent of what we call like deep time. So a lot of the other scientists at the time thought the world was only like a few thousand years old, or maybe hundreds of thousands of years old. Buffon and some of the others were other scientists were like, to understand like the variation that we're seeing in life, in nature, the world must be much older, probably millions of years. And of course now we know it's like billions of years. But this was very controversial at the time. Think in terms of like, religious influences on culture and in science, that most people thought, no, the world is only a few thousand years old. And so, this was an issue of conflict between these two, science and religion, that the scientists were like, well, the evidence is like, we can't keep believing that. The evidence is clear. It's clearly pointing to the fact that the world is much, much older than that, for all of these processes to have happened, whether like geological or biological. The next one, slide 9, Cuvier. So he had a lot of ideas about like natural disasters, and because a lot of these scientists at the time were thinking in terms, they were starting to notice there's probably not just biological processes happening in the world, but like geological processes, and there's something that's going on like over deep time in the world on Earth in terms of like land and water, and also the biological life. Like there has to be a lot of time for all these things to happen. And so he was kind of a proponent of this idea that this is happening, but also he's also a proponent of this idea in terms of, what's the word I'm thinking of, like extinction of species, that because a lot of the scientists didn't have an explanation to why they were starting to dig up animals and starting to realize these animals don't exist anymore. They needed an explanation. And they didn't really think about, well, just sometimes that happens, they go extinct because of resources, or maybe, one animal outhunts another, like, the way we would kind of consider it today. At the time, they thought, a lot of religious influence, what they thought was, well, God created all of animals, and he must have been the one to destroy them. So maybe we're seeing like multiple like kind of like creation events, like maybe there was like all these animals and then God destroyed them, and there's a new creation event, and all the other animals are just like dead in the ground. Like, so there's at this time a lot of religious influence on what they're trying to explain, and of course that makes sense. At the time, that's what they had available to them to try to explain what they were seeing. So that kind of makes sense. Not quite correct. Slide 10, Lamarck. So maybe you might have heard a little bit about Lamarck, Lamarckian evolution. This term is kind of getting a comeback, I would say incorrectly, but I'm hearing it thrown around. That's a whole topic for another day. But Lamarck almost got it right. Of course, all of these individuals are kind of building on the people before them. Like, they had this idea, I'm going to build on that. Like, this is the way science works, right? So Lamarck was like, okay, there's change over time. He even, similar to Darwin, had the idea that it had something to do with traits that were being from like mother or father to offspring. He didn't understand the mechanism, though. He didn't really understand the way it was working. But he thought, okay, there's probably something to that in some way. And what he thought was, I have a picture. I do not, of course I don't. What he thought was, okay, and I think there's a picture in your book, too, that gives a really good example of, like, Lamarckian versus Darwinian. That Lamarck thought, okay, imagine you have, like, some giraffes, and they need to reach this tall tree to get their leaves for food. Obviously, the ones with the longer neck will be able to reach. So that's correct. Darwin noticed the same thing. But Lamarck would say, the ones with the short necks, if they stretch and stretch and stretch over their lifetime, and really stretch, their offspring will be born with a slightly more stretched neck. So that's obviously, we know that's not the way it works. Like, if I work out and get like really like buff, if I have kids, they're not going to be buff just because of that. That's not how genetics works. Now, they might be predisposed to genetics that allow them to build muscle faster, but that's not the same thing, right? Nothing you do in your lifetime is going to influence that same trait in your offspring. So Lamarck didn't get it right. He was almost there. He was on the right track, didn't quite get it right. But I would say a lot of people were like, oh, Lamarck, what a dummy. But imagine, like, at the time, he was like on the forefront of something. Like, he almost had it. And he was definitely further along than a lot of other scientists. But like I said, I've heard his Lamarckian evolution and Lamarck getting thrown around a lot lately because of this field called epigenetics. And I'll just say this is a new field. You might have heard about it. We might touch on that a little bit in this class, but it's not the same. Epigenetics and Lamarckian evolution are not the same. There are some similarities, but unfortunately I've heard this like, Lamarckian evolution's true. No, you're wrong. That's just a buzzword you're using to get people to read your article. That's my stance on that. Okay. But, okay, Lamarck. So Lamarck almost got it. Next, slide 11, Charles Lyell. So he wrote this book called Principles, I should say Principles of Geology. I'm sorry, there's like a typo. But, so more on like the natural processes of the earth, not just like the biology, but that he noticed, look, there's things happening in terms of like volcanoes and earthquakes and glaciers are moving. And then this is right around the time of like plate tectonics, like, whoa, maybe all these giant land masses are actually moving around slowly through time. People were like, no way, you know. So when you start thinking about that process and the fact that the world is way older than they thought, you start to get a bigger picture of what could have been happening over time in the world. And then slide 12, Thomas Malthus. So he focuses research on human populations, but he talks a lot about, this is a major influence on Darwin, talked a lot about human populations and access to resources and competition for those resources, and how this can be an issue within like society. But Darwin took that idea and was like, that's true. Can we expand that to like all of nature? Are resources finite? Is there competition? Of course, because like I said before, like at the time, people didn't really visualize it that way. Like Darwin was not the only one, but was one of the first to say, nature is not some romantic like picnic in the park. There is violence, there is competition, there is death, and that's just how it works. You know, animals are trying to escape from being eaten. Other animals might eat another animal to feed their babies. Like, this is just, nature is it can be beautiful, but it is also harsh. There is a lot going on here, and you guys need to get out like of this idea that it is beautiful and there's some beautiful balance to nature. And he would say there's a balance in terms of like, yes, because you're gonna kill them, they're gonna kill you. Like, there's balance in that there's gonna be competition and fighting, in that sense, like over resources, whether it's like, you know, food, plant, animal, or like mating resources. That's true. So he took that idea and was like, Malthus was on the right track in terms of this idea of like competition and resources. Took that to expanded it to all of nature, and then came with this idea of natural selection. Okay, so I feel like I left a couple of things open. Like, you might be like, wait a minute, what about that one thing? What about the other thing? We're going to continue a lot of the kind of, unfortunately, sorry, like the 8 tangents I went on. We're going to talk about all of those when we get into, we have some PowerPoints coming up on like human variation, the forces of evolution, genetics, and heredity. We're going to talk about those. That'll be fun. But now you'll already have a preface to some of those. Okay, so I will see you guys on the next video lecture.